My sister convinced Dad to sign over his rental properties while on morphine, so I got the hospice nurse's testimony. The call came from property line management at 11:15 on a Thursday morning, while I was replacing a kitchen faucet in one of Dad's rental units on Maple Street. "Mr. Garrett, we need to clarify something about the ownership transfer," the office manager said, her voice carefully neutral in that way people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "All 7 properties were transferred to Rachel Garrett's name last week, and she's requested we send all future correspondence and rent payments to her directly. We wanted to confirm you're aware of this change before we update our systems." I stood there in the empty kitchen with a wrench in my hand, water still dripping from the disconnected pipes, trying to process what she'd just said. "That's impossible," I told her. "Dad's still alive. He wouldn't transfer anything without telling me." There was a pause. "The paperwork came through the county recorder's office on Monday. Quitclaim deeds for all 7 properties. Your father's signature is notarized on every document." I drove straight to the county recorder's office, not bothering to finish the faucet, not even locking the unit behind me. The clerk pulled up the digital records while I stood at the counter feeling my pulse in my throat. 7 deeds, all dated the previous Friday, all transferring properties from Leonard Garrett to Rachel Marie Garrett for $1 and other valuable consideration. Dad's signature wobbled across each page, barely legible, nothing like his usual confident script. And there was Rachel's name as the notary witness, her neat signature and stamp making everything official and legal and utterly wrong. "Can I get copies of these?" I asked, my voice coming out strange and tight. The clerk printed them without comment, probably used to family drama playing out at her counter. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and read through each deed 3 times, looking for some explanation that would make this make sense. There wasn't one. Dad had been dying for 3 months, ever since the oncologist at Memorial Hospital delivered the diagnosis that ended our world. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, metastasized to his liver and lungs, maybe 6 months if the chemotherapy worked, maybe less if it didn't. He'd built his rental portfolio over 40 years, starting with a duplex he bought at 25 and expanding property by property through careful saving and leveraging equity. 7 residential properties scattered across the city, from student rentals near the university to family homes in established neighborhoods. They generated enough income that Dad had retired at 62, spending his days fishing and doing crossword puzzles and taking Mom on the road trips she'd always wanted. When Mom died of a stroke 4 years ago, those properties became Dad's entire focus and legacy. "These are for you and Rachel," he told me a dozen times. "Everything I built, split right down the middle. You've earned it, helping me all these years." Rachel had moved to San Diego after college, visited maybe twice a year, called on holidays. I was the one who'd collected rent, fixed toilets, painted apartments, showed units to prospective tenants. Dad promised me that work would pay off eventually. Rachel flew home the day after Dad's diagnosis, which surprised me because she'd missed Mom's funeral, claiming her job at some tech startup couldn't spare her. Suddenly she was taking family medical leave, moving into Dad's house in the guest bedroom, positioning herself as the devoted daughter who'd dropped everything to care for her dying father. At first, I was grateful. Dad needed round-the-clock attention as the cancer progressed and the treatments ravaged his body. I had my own family, my wife Stephanie and our 2 kids, and I was still managing Dad's properties, which had become more than a full-time job. Rachel being there meant Dad wasn't alone, meant someone could monitor his medications and drive him to appointments. But within 2 weeks, Rachel had established herself as the gatekeeper. When I'd stop by after work, she'd meet me at the door with updates delivered in a hushed, proprietary voice. "Dad's resting right now. Maybe come back tomorrow." Or, "He had a rough night. He doesn't really want visitors." I'd find myself standing on my own father's porch, being managed and controlled by my sister, who hadn't bothered to visit in 8 months. The hospice nurse started coming in early September, after Dad's oncologist admitted the chemotherapy wasn't working, and it was time to focus on comfort rather than cure. Her name was Teresa Kim, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and efficient hands, who'd seen 1,000 people die and somehow maintained her humanity through all of it. She came 3 times a week initially, then daily as Dad deteriorated, managing his pain medications and monitoring his vital signs and teaching Rachel and me how to care for him in these final stages. Teresa always documented everything in meticulous detail: Dad's pain levels, his mental state, his medication dosages, his ability to communicate. I'd see her sitting at Dad's kitchen table after her visits, typing notes into her laptop, creating a medical record of his decline. Dad liked her. On his good days, when the morphine wasn't too heavy and his mind was still clear, he'd joke with her about the Seahawks or ask about her daughter who was applying to colleges. On bad days, he'd barely register her presence, lost in the fog of pain and medication. By late September, Dad was on a continuous morphine drip through a pump that delivered consistent pain relief. The hospice doctor had prescribed it after Dad's pain became unmanageable with oral medications. He'd wake up screaming, his body racked with agony as the tumors pressed against organs and nerves. The pump changed everything. Dad became drowsy, distant, his lucid moments growing shorter and less frequent. He'd sleep 18 hours a day, wake confused about where he was or what year it was, struggle to hold conversations that made sense. Teresa documented all of this, noting in her records that Dad's cognitive function was severely impaired and he was unable to make complex decisions or understand detailed information. I remember one afternoon sitting beside his bed while he drifted in and out of consciousness, trying to tell me something about the properties but losing the thread of his thoughts, mid-sentence, his eyes unfocused and frightened. Rachel hovered in the doorway, watching us, saying nothing. I thought she was just being protective. I didn't realize she was waiting for me to leave. The deeds were signed on Friday, September 23rd. I didn't know that until I saw them at the county recorder's office. But once I had the date, I started reconstructing that day. I'd been at the Maple Street property that morning, replacing the water heater with a plumber I'd hired. The old tenant had moved out, and I was turning the unit for new renters, trying to keep the properties running smoothly while Dad was dying. I'd stopped by Dad's house around 6 in the evening, bringing dinner from the Italian place he used to love, hoping maybe he'd be alert enough to eat a few bites. Rachel met me at the door. "He's had a really hard day," she said, blocking the entrance with her body. "Teresa had to increase his morphine this morning because the pain was so bad. He's been completely out of it since noon. Maybe just let him rest tonight." I'd peered past her into the living room, where Dad's hospital bed had been set up so he could look out at the garden Mom had planted. He was motionless under the blankets, his breathing shallow and rattling. "I'll just sit with him for a minute," I said, but Rachel's hand was firm on my arm. "Michael, he doesn't even know you're here. Come back tomorrow when he might actually be conscious." I went home that night feeling guilty for being relieved. Watching Dad die was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and some part of me was grateful for permission to take a night off from the vigil. Stephanie and I had dinner with our kids, helped them with homework, watched a movie that I couldn't focus on because my mind kept drifting to Dad's hospital bed and his labored breathing. I fell asleep on the couch around 11 and dreamed about the duplex Dad had bought when I was 3 years old, the first property, the foundation of everything he'd built. In the dream, Dad was young and healthy, showing me how to fix a leaky pipe, his hands steady and sure. When I woke up at 2 in the morning, my phone had 3 missed calls from Rachel. I called back immediately, my heart hammering, certain Dad had died. "False alarm," Rachel said when she answered. "He had some breathing trouble, but he's stable now. Teresa came by and adjusted things. Go back to sleep." Her voice had a strange quality I couldn't identify. Satisfaction, maybe, or excitement. I didn't think about it at the time. The following Thursday, when Property Line Management called about the ownership transfer, I finally understood what had happened on that Friday. Rachel had waited until Dad was heavily sedated, barely conscious, his mind scrambled by morphine and cancer and the approaching end. She'd brought the quitclaim deeds to his bedside, documents she'd clearly prepared in advance, working with some notary service that asked no questions and verified nothing. She'd put papers in front of Dad while he drifted in pharmaceutical fog, guided his hand across signature lines, told him he was signing something routine or harmless. Maybe Dad thought he was signing a get-well card. Maybe he had no idea he was signing anything at all. Maybe his hand just moved where Rachel directed it, his dying brain too compromised to resist or understand. And then Rachel had notarized the documents herself, swearing under penalty of perjury that Dad had appeared before her and signed willingly and understood what he was doing. 7 properties, transferred in one afternoon while I was replacing a water heater 3 miles away, while Dad was drowning in morphine. I confronted Rachel that night at Dad's house, walking in without knocking because it was still my father's house, even if she'd stationed herself there like an occupying force. Dad was asleep in his hospital bed, or unconscious. Hard to tell the difference anymore. Rachel was in the kitchen making tea, still wearing the cardigan and yoga pants that had become her uniform of caregiving. Property Line Management called me, I said without preamble. They said all the properties are in your name now. They said Dad signed quitclaim deeds last Friday. Rachel didn't even have the decency to look surprised or guilty. She poured hot water over her teabag with steady hands and turned to face me with an expression of calm righteousness. Dad wanted to make sure everything was settled before he died, she said. He decided I should have the properties because I've sacrificed everything to take care of him these past months. I left my job, Michael. I left my life in San Diego to be here. You've just been managing properties like always. I've been holding his hand while he dies. The audacity of it stunned me into momentary silence. Dad promised those properties to both of us, I finally said, my voice shaking. He told me 100 times they'd be split evenly. That was always the plan. Rachel sipped her tea, watching me over the rim of her mug. Plans change. Dad changed his mind. He's allowed to do that. I pulled out my phone and showed her the copies of the deeds I'd gotten from the county recorder. These are dated last Friday. Dad was barely conscious last Friday. Teresa had just increased his morphine dose because his pain was out of control. There's no way he understood what he was signing. Rachel's expression didn't flicker. He had a lucid moment in the afternoon. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to take care of the daughter who took care of him. The lie was so brazen, so complete, that I couldn't even process it. You're telling me Dad voluntarily gave you 7 properties worth millions of dollars without discussing it with me first, without talking to his lawyer, while he was pumped full of morphine? Rachel set down her tea. That's exactly what I'm telling you, and it's legal and notarized and done. I left before I said something I'd regret. before the rage building in my chest exploded into words or worse. I drove to Stephanie and spent an hour pacing our kitchen while she searched for probate attorneys on her laptop. "This is elder abuse," Stephanie said, her voice tight with anger. "Your sister drugged your dying father and stole his life's work. We're fighting this, but I didn't know if we could fight it. The deeds were signed, notarized, recorded with the county. Rachel had created legal documents that looked legitimate on their surface. Dad was dying. He'd probably be gone within days or weeks. And once he died, there'd be no way to ask him what actually happened in those morphine-soaked final days. I felt like I was watching everything Dad built dissolve in front of me, stolen by the daughter who'd barely bothered to know him until she smelled inheritance. I sat at our kitchen table at 2 a.m, looking at photocopies of Dad's shaky signature on documents transferring away his legacy, and tried to figure out how to prove what I knew in my bones, that Rachel had manipulated a dying man for money. Dad died 6 days later, on a Wednesday evening in early October. I was there, and Rachel was there, and Teresa was there, monitoring Dad's breathing as it slowed and became more labored and finally stopped. Teresa pronounced him deceased at 8:43, her voice gentle and professional, giving us privacy for our grief. Rachel cried, real tears, which infuriated me because what right did she have to cry for the man she'd just robbed? I sat beside Dad's body, holding his still warm hand, and felt the loss like a physical wound. My father was gone, and his legacy was stolen, and I didn't know how to fix either of those things. The funeral was 3 days later. Rachel played the grieving daughter perfectly, accepting condolences with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling voice. Relatives I hadn't seen in years told me how wonderful it was that Rachel had come home to care for Dad in his final months. I smiled and nodded and said nothing, because what was I supposed to say? That she'd stolen everything while Dad was too drugged to stop her? The probate attorney Stephanie found was named David Wu, a man in his 50s who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. We met in his office the week after Dad's funeral, and I showed him everything: the quitclaim deeds, the timeline of Dad's decline, the medical diagnosis proving Dad had terminal cancer and was on heavy pain medication. David listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions about Dad's mental state and Rachel's access to him. "This type of situation is unfortunately common," David said. "Family members see an opportunity during a loved one's final illness and take advantage. The legal term is undue influence, using a position of trust to manipulate someone into making decisions they wouldn't make if they were thinking clearly. The problem is proving it. Your sister has legal documents with your father's signature. We need evidence that your father was mentally incapable of understanding what he was signing on that specific day." I thought about Teresa, sitting at Dad's kitchen table with her laptop, documenting everything. "The hospice nurse," I said. "She was there that day. She keeps detailed medical records." David requested Teresa's complete medical records for Dad's hospice care, which required Dad's estate to grant permission since patient privacy laws survived death. As the executor of Dad's will, the original will, the one Dad had made years ago, leaving everything split between Rachel and me, I had authority to access those records. They arrived 2 weeks later. 60 pages of clinical notes documenting Dad's final 3 months. I read them in David's office, seeing Dad's decline translated into medical terminology: patient exhibiting decreased cognitive function, severe pain requiring increased morphine dosage, patient non-responsive to verbal stimuli. And there it was, in Teresa's notes from Friday, September 23rd, called to patient's home at 10:15 a.m. due to uncontrolled pain, patient screaming, unable to find comfortable position. Increased morphine pump from 4 mg/h to 8 mg/h per physician standing orders. By 11:30 a.m., patient heavily sedated and non-responsive. Remained at bedside until 1 p.m. to monitor vital signs and ensure pain control adequate. Patient did not regain consciousness during my visit. Advise family member that patient will likely remain sedated for remainder of day. David read the note 3 times, then looked up at me with something like satisfaction in his eyes. "This is it," he said. "Your sister had your father sign those deeds while he was non-responsive and heavily sedated. According to the hospice nurse's medical documentation, your father was medically incapable of understanding or consenting to any legal document that day. He started drafting a petition to void the quitclaim deeds based on Dad's lack of mental capacity and Rachel's undue influence. But we needed more than just medical records. We needed Teresa herself to testify about Dad's condition, to explain in clear terms that Dad couldn't have understood what he was signing." David prepared a deposition notice for Teresa, requesting her expert testimony about Dad's cognitive state during his final weeks. I worried she wouldn't want to get involved, that she'd seen too many family disputes and would refuse to take sides. But when David's paralegal called to schedule the deposition, Teresa agreed immediately. "I remember Mr. Garrett very clearly," she told the paralegal, "and I remember that Friday. I'll testify to whatever you need." The deposition took place in David's conference room on a gray morning in November. Teresa arrived precisely on time, wearing professional clothing instead of her usual scrubs, carrying a folder with her own copies of Dad's medical records. Rachel's attorney was there too, a slick corporate lawyer named Brian Foster, who specialized in real estate transactions and looked deeply uncomfortable with the medical malpractice overtones of this dispute. David began with establishing Teresa's credentials: her nursing degree, her 15 years in hospice care, her experience with terminal cancer patients. Then he walked her through Dad's decline, having her explain his diagnosis, his pain levels, his medications, his cognitive deterioration. Teresa answered every question with calm professionalism, occasionally referencing her notes to confirm dates and dosages. She described how pancreatic cancer caused severe pain that required aggressive management, how morphine at high doses caused sedation and confusion, how patients in Dad's condition often lost the ability to understand complex information or make reasoned decisions. Then David asked about Friday, September 23rd. Teresa didn't need to check her notes. She remembered that day clearly. I received a call from Mr. Garrett's daughter, Rachel, around 10 in the morning, Teresa testified. She said her father was in severe pain and nothing was helping. When I arrived at the house, Mr. Garrett was in extreme distress. He was crying out, thrashing in bed, clearly in agony. I immediately increased his morphine pump dosage from 4 milligrams per hour to 8 milligrams per hour, which was the maximum allowed under the physician's standing orders. Within about 90 minutes, the increased dosage took effect. Mr. Garrett became heavily sedated and non-responsive. David leaned forward. What do you mean by non-responsive? Teresa was very clear. He didn't respond to his name being called. He didn't track movement with his eyes. He didn't answer questions. He appeared to be in a deep, medication-induced sleep. I stayed at the house until 1 in the afternoon to monitor him and make sure the pain was controlled. During that entire time, he didn't regain consciousness. Based on your professional experience, David asked, would Mr. Garrett have been capable of understanding and signing legal documents that afternoon? Teresa's answer was unequivocal. Absolutely not. Mr. Garrett was not capable of understanding anything that afternoon. He was heavily sedated with a powerful opioid. He couldn't engage in conversation, couldn't make coherent decisions, couldn't have understood the nature or consequences of signing any documents. If someone had put papers in front of him and guided his hand to sign, he might have made marks on the paper, but he wouldn't have known what he was signing or why. He was, in medical terms, mentally incapacitated. Rachel's attorney tried to create doubt during his cross-examination. Didn't patients sometimes have lucid moments even when heavily medicated? Wasn't it possible Mr. Garrett had woken up later that afternoon? Teresa shut down every attempt. Patients on 8 milligrams of morphine per hour don't have spontaneous lucid moments, she said firmly. At that dosage, they remain sedated for hours, and I documented in my notes that I advised the family Mr. Garrett would likely remain sedated for the remainder of the day. David filed our petition to void the quitclaim deeds the following week, attaching Teresa's deposition and medical records as exhibits. The legal argument was straightforward. Dad lacked the mental capacity to execute valid legal documents on September 23rd due to heavy sedation from morphine, and Rachel had exercised undue influence over Dad during his final illness to manipulate him into signing away his properties. The court scheduled a hearing for January. Rachel filed an opposition claiming Dad had been competent and had made a voluntary decision to give her the properties in recognition of her caregiving. Her attorney submitted a declaration from Rachel describing how she'd sacrificed her career and life to care for Dad, and arguing that Dad's decision was a reasonable expression of gratitude. The declaration made no mention of Dad's morphine dosage or medical condition on the day he supposedly made this decision. It painted Rachel as a devoted daughter and me as a greedy son trying to overturn Dad's final wishes. The hearing lasted 4 hours. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Carol Hendricks, who'd spent decades handling probate disputes and looked profoundly unimpressed with Rachel's story. David presented Teresa's testimony, Dad's medical records, and expert analysis of Dad's mental capacity. He showed the timeline. Teresa documenting Dad's non-responsive state in the late morning, the deeds dated that same afternoon, Rachel's suspicious behavior in limiting my access to Dad, the complete absence of any prior indication that Dad intended to disinherit me. Rachel's attorney argued that Dad had retained the right to change his estate plan however he wished, that the deeds were properly executed and notarized, that Rachel's caregiving justified Dad's decision. But Judge Hendricks kept returning to one question. Was Mr. Garrett mentally capable of understanding what he was signing on September 23rd? Rachel's attorney couldn't answer that question because the medical evidence was overwhelming that Dad wasn't capable of understanding anything that day. Judge Hendricks issued her ruling from the bench without taking time to deliberate. Based on the medical evidence presented, I find that Leonard Garrett was not mentally competent to execute quitclaim deeds on September 23rd, she said, her voice crisp and definitive. The hospice nurse's contemporaneous medical notes established that Mr. Garrett was heavily sedated and non-responsive on that date due to morphine administered for pain control. He was not capable of understanding the nature, extent, or consequences of transferring 7 properties worth several $1 million. Furthermore, I find that Rachel Garrett exercised undue influence over her father during his final illness, isolating him from his son and manipulating him into signing documents while he was mentally incapacitated. This behavior constitutes elder abuse under state law. The judge voided all 7 quitclaim deeds, ordering the properties returned to Dad's estate for distribution according to his original will. Rachel sat frozen in her chair, her face pale. The judge wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm ordering Rachel Garrett to pay Michael Garrett's attorney's fees and costs, which I'm setting at $32,000, reflecting the fact that this litigation was necessitated by Ms. Garrett's wrongful conduct. Rachel tried to appeal, but her attorney advised her the ruling was solid. The medical evidence was too clear. Teresa's testimony too credible, the timeline too damning. The appeal would cost tens of thousands in additional legal fees, with virtually no chance of success. Rachel dropped it. The properties were transferred back to Dad's estate, and I began the process of distributing them according to Dad's will. Half to me, half to Rachel, exactly as Dad had always intended. Rachel was entitled to inherit 3.5 properties despite what she'd done, because that's what Dad's will specified, and I wasn't going to stoop to her level by trying to change it. She sold her share immediately, taking the money and moving back to San Diego without speaking to me again. I kept my share, continuing to manage them the way Dad had taught me, maintaining the legacy he'd built over 40 years. The properties generate steady income that helps support my family, and eventually they'll pass to my kids, the grandchildren Dad never got to see grow up. Sometimes I drive past Dad's old house, which I sold because I couldn't stand to see Rachel's manipulation imprinted on every room. I think about that Friday afternoon, Dad drowning in morphine while Rachel put papers in front of him and guided his hand across signature lines, stealing everything while I was miles away replacing a water heater. I think about Teresa sitting at Dad's kitchen table, documenting his condition with meticulous care, creating the evidence that would eventually expose Rachel's theft. I think about how close Rachel came to succeeding. If Teresa hadn't kept such detailed records, if I hadn't thought to request them, if the judge hadn't seen through Rachel's performance of grief and caregiving. The properties are safe now, split the way Dad intended, generating income the way he planned. But what Rachel took from me wasn't just money or real estate, it was the ability to grieve my father without rage, to remember his final days without thinking about my sister's betrayal. That's the theft that can't be returned by any court order. 3 years later, I manage Dad's properties with the same attention he taught me, and Rachel lives 2,000 miles away with her half of the inheritance spent. The hospice nurse's testimony saved Dad's legacy, proving that morphine-clouded signatures aren't consent and that medical records tell truths families try to hide. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.